So, like I said, American power is going to tip the balance and put it in the favor of the Allies. So, before we can even get there, though, we have to mobilize our troops, and recruitment is necessary because we had only 200,000 men in service in the United States. We had very few officers with any sort of combat experience. Our weapons were out of date, and we had a very small Air Force. We had only 55 planes, but we had 130 pilots, but we had only 55 planes, so we didn't even have enough planes for the pilots that we did have. So we needed to recruit, and we needed to draft. And so in World War I, the U.S. is going to open the draft, and the draft is going to require registration of eligible fighting men, that you register for the draft, and if your name comes up, then you serve. So it's called the Selective Service Act, and it applied to anyone who was between the age, or excuse me, not to anyone, to males between the ages of 18 and 45. Now there were some exemptions. You could get exempted from it. For example, if you were married and you had children and you were the sole provider for your family, then you could be exempted. People with certain levels of education could be exempted. People who were in vital jobs like doctors or lawyers or teachers or those kinds of things could be exempted. It depended on the case, basically. It was usually looked at case by case. Anyway, so that means who served in World War I for the U.S. The average age was 21 to 23. A lot of them didn't have high school education, so not very well educated, and actually 20% of them were foreign born. They had been born in another country but were citizens of the U.S. And become citizens of the U.S. through the naturalization process. So once these men were recruited or drafted, they did have to go through a training period, and it was a 9-month training period. It's not like it was something that happened overnight. And so part of that will be done in the U.S. and part of that's done in Europe. And during this 9 months, they would put in 17-hour days where they would work on target practice, bayonet drills. Then they'd also do things like kitchen duty and cleaning up the grounds and those kinds of things, as well as the regular things of learning how to use your weapons and PT and all that kind of stuff. So they were very, very busy guys. Real weapons were not always available, and so a lot of times they were using fake or imaginary ones because we didn't have enough weapons produced for all these new drafted soldiers. So they would use like rocks for grenades, or they'd use wooden poles for rifles. Women were not drafted, but they could serve in World War I. In the Navy, they served in non-combat positions, and so we had about 13,000 nurses, secretaries, telephone operators who received full military rank. The Army will accept women, but they would get no rank, pay, or benefits, and they did basically the same job of nursing, secretaries, telephone operators, that kind of thing. African Americans also will serve in World War I, but they will serve in segregated units, which means that they were separated, blacks from whites. And they were not allowed in the Navy or the Marines because it was very hard to separate them on board a ship. Their officers were usually white, and most of the time they were assigned to non-combat duties. So they weren't put on the front lines because basically at this point we're still very racist and prejudiced in the U.S., and we don't trust them to handle weapons and to do military maneuvers. Now, that being said, there are always exceptions. The 369th Infantry Regiment was an all-black regiment, including officers, that is going to serve in World War I, and they actually will see more continuous duty than any other American regiment in the war, white or black. And so they are on the front lines more for a longer period of time than any other regiment. So that makes them very distinct in that way. So the key to American success in World War I is that we needed to build a bridge to France. And this is not an actual bridge, but we needed to be able to get a way to get soldiers and supplies from Britain, which was not conquered, to France, which was under attack and very hard to do with German U-boats in the English Channel. So we need to have a way to combat the U-boats. That's our problem. We need to be able to combat those U-boats and find a way to get around them. So our solution is a 4-step solution. The first is that we're going to give draft exemptions for shipyard workers because we want them to be in the shipyards building ships because we need ships. The second is that we are going to have a pretty hefty public campaign that we're going to emphasize the importance of shipyard work and try and recruit more and more workers there. Welders and metal workers, all kinds of stuff in order to get them into that business. The third is fabrication, and this is a new construction technique that basically said that you would have standard parts. Rather than making each ship individually, you would make carbon copies, cookie cutter copies of each other, so that if one ship gets blown up, you can use parts from it in another ship to repair it, rather than having to create something new and original. It's going to reduce the time that it was needed to make ships. It's also going to reduce the cost as well. So that was a huge innovation. The fourth is that we're going to take privately owned ships, so people's yachts or shipping ships, I don't know what they're called, big ships that can haul stuff. We're going to take those privately owned ships and confiscate them by the government and rework them to become military ships. So in this way, we are able to rebuild or build up our military very, very quickly, which is something that we probably could have struggled with, but we didn't. So with our new military, with our new Navy, we are going to be able to break the blockade. And not the British blockade, because the British are on our side. We are breaking the German blockade, counter blockade, with their U-boats. So we're going to use something called a convoy system, and the convoy system would have a merchant ship in the middle, which would be carrying our supplies and our weapons and our soldiers, and we would surround that with destroyers and cruisers in order to combat against the U-boats. So making it more difficult for the U-boat to get to its target. We're also going to place a huge mine system, about 230 miles of barriers in the English Channel. And because of that, our losses are going to be lessened. Our ships are going to be sunk less often. And then it almost stops completely. And a lot of those mines are still there. I don't know if you guys have seen Finding Nemo, but remember the part where you have the sharks and the floating balls? Those are mines, and they're not exactly the ones from World War I, but they're very similar. And there's still some that go off every so often because something knocks against them, and every so often you'll hear a story in the newspaper or on the news of another mine exploded under the English Channel and that kind of stuff. So there's still mines there from World War I. Eventually, like I said, we get to Europe and we begin fighting in Europe. And the impact of the U.S. troops is that we're fresh troops. We get there in 1917, late 1917, and remember, the French and the British have been fighting since 1914. So they've been fighting for 3 years and have endured losses. And here comes the Americans who are like, gung-ho, we're going to go kick some German butt kind of thing. And we're very enthusiastic. We're very, rose-colored glasses. We see everything like, oh my goodness, we're here and we're going to win, and why haven't you guys done this before, sort of thing. But what we're going to find is that it's not quite that way. It's not quite the war we were envisioning. So the American troops come over, and we are called the AEF, which is the American Expeditionary Force, which is led by General John J. Pershing. And at first we serve as replacements. So whenever French and British soldiers died on the line, we'd send in, 5 or 10 or 20 Americans to replace them. But General Pershing didn't want that to be the role of the Americans. Instead, he wanted to keep the Americans as a separate army that could aggressively attack. So keep us all together and use us to attack against the Germans, rather than trickling us into the front lines where we aren't going to do as much good. Now, the incentive for him to do this is that if it looks like we came in and we won the war, then it's going to give the U.S. a very strong voice at the peace table. However, if it looks like we came in and just helped out a little bit on the front lines as we trickled into the front lines, we're not going to have that much of a voice. We want to come in and look like we are dominating. So that's why he wants to keep us as a separate force. Like I said, we come in, we're very fresh, we're enthusiastic, we are thinking, oh my gosh, or oh my goodness, this is going to be the best war ever. We're just going to wipe the ground with them and win. But what the Americans found is a very eye-opening experience for them, because life in the trenches is not all it was cracked up to be. Most of these young men going into war had never experienced war before, and so it's not what their grandpas had told them it was like. It's very different. Remember, their grandpas had probably fought in the Napoleonic style, and these young men are going to be fighting in a very different style of warfare with industrialized and trench warfare. So what leads into trench warfare? What are the things that they are facing that their grandfathers or their fathers had never had to face before? A lot of it are these new weapons. The first were the machine guns, and the machine guns were what led to trench warfare. Because the machine gun could rapidly fire up to 600 rounds a minute, you had to hide from the thing. And you couldn't just hide behind trees. So they dug into the ground, because that was the only protection you could get from the machine gun. Now, the pros of a machine gun is that it could rapidly fire. Like I said, you could get up to 600 rounds a minute. That's a lot of bullets flying in the air with just one gun. Imagine if you had multiples. And the cons of it, however, is that they're not the LMGs or the light machine guns that you guys are probably envisioning today. These were larger machine guns. They were usually mounted on wheels. They were usually gas powered, which means that they would overheat. And so you had problems with mobility. You had problems with overheating. You'd have to keep a water source nearby in order to keep it cooled down so it could continue to fire, because if it got too hot, your ammunition's exploding in your face. That's not good. And so there's a classic example of men having to actually cool it down by urinating on it, so that way it wouldn't overheat and they could continue to use it. So that's the first major weapon. The second is the tank, and the tank was invented by the British, and they originally called it a land battleship. But when they were shipping it to France to use against the Germans, they didn't want the Germans to know what it was. So they labeled it as a water tank, because that was the only thing they could think of that would be big enough to fit in a crate that they were sending over. They didn't want to label it land battleship. So they labeled it as a water tank. And so the word tank has always stuck with it ever since. That's how it's got its name. Now, the pros of the tank is that it was made of steel, and so bullets would bounce off of it. That was awesome. It could go over the barbed wire that was between the trenches, so that was awesome. But again, it's not the tanks that you're thinking of today. These were basically trucks with steel plating on them. They're not the tanks that you can envision today. Those are coming later. They get further developed and refined. These are basically plain old dolly trucks with steel plating on them. That's really all it was. The problems with this is that because it's got all the steel plating on it, it's going to be very heavy, and in the French territory where they were fighting, which was very muggy and swampy, it's going to sink in the mud and get stuck, and then you're kind of a sitting duck for grenades and heavy artillery and that kind of stuff. The third weapon that will be developed is the airplane. Now, it actually isn't invented by the people of World War I, but it's going to become used by both sides. It's first used for scouting, just flying over and seeing where troops are and how many and what their location is and what they're planning on doing and that kind of thing. But eventually, by the end of World War I, it's going to be mounted with machine guns. And these machine guns are going to allow you to have aerial assaults where you could fight it out in the air. And so you get these dog fights. That's what they're called, are dog fights, where you have the aces from the Allies fighting the aces from Germany. And so you get... like for the U.S., we had Eddie Rickenbacker, who was a famous flying ace for the U.S., had like 20-some kills. And the Germans will have the Red Baron, and he also is going to become very famous. Now, the cons for the airplane is that it's not very fast. It's not a fast airplane until later in the war. It gets a little bit more speed as they are developing it better. So it does take a little while. In fact, the Red Baron is going to be killed by somebody shooting him from the ground. So you could, I mean, that's a great example of how his plane wasn't that fast if somebody from the ground can shoot you and take you out. The fourth new weapon is poison gas, and poison gas, no surprise, is developed by the Germans. The pros of poison gas is that you could use it to sabotage your enemy. You were able to take them out without actually seeing them. The cons is that it could turn on yourself. If the wind changed or shifted, it could actually turn on your own army. Now, there are 3 different types of gases that will be used in World War I. The first is a nerve gas, and that just destroys your nerves. Basically, it attacks your spinal cord and your brain, and you can go blind, and you lose your sense of taste and smell and that kind of stuff. The second type is chlorine, and chlorine gas burns your lungs. So if you've ever been around like a swimming pool that has too much chlorine, it makes it kind of hard to breathe. That's what chlorine gas does to you. It actually infiltrates your lungs and melts your lungs. So you essentially are drowning in your own blood. The third type is mustard gas. And mustard gas burns skin. So you get like boils and stuff. Especially moist areas. So if you can imagine, it's the middle of July and you're in France in a trench and somebody dumps mustard gas in your trench. The moist areas of your body are going to be like your eyes and your mouth, your armpits, your groin region. That's where you're going to start getting these huge welts and basically burning your skin. Very, very painful, and eventually, if left untreated, you're going to get gangrene, and it's just going to be ultimately unpleasant. The submarines are the next major invention. Like I said, they were developed by the Germans, and they were damaging to shipping because the Allies don't have anything nearly as advanced. We don't have anything like that, and we're just astounded that they have these things. The sixth is that uniforms are going to change. Prior to World War I, everybody wore their national colors. That was what you did. You wore your national colors. Well, like for France, they were wearing reds and blues and whites, and so were the British. And so you can see them out on the field, and so it makes pretty easy targets. So that's how camouflage is going to be developed, the greens and the browns that are worn today. The gas mask is going to become a part of the uniform as well. Number 7, communications will change, like the telegraph and the telephone are going to be used as essential parts of the war. Number 8, transportation will change as well. Railroads and armored cars, again, used as a part of the war machine. And 9, medical treatment is going to make advances because the nurses and the doctors had to deal with new things. They had to deal with the filth and the lice and the rats and the bad water, the poison gas, the decaying body, the lack of sleep, a new psychotic disease called shell shock and trench foot. And trench foot was where, because there was usually a layer of mud at the bottom of the trenches and you were constantly walking in it, your feet basically rotted. And so that was something that you had to deal with. Now the Red Cross is there in World War I. They're not quite on the front lines, but they're there to help with the care of the soldiers. Well, eventually with the U.S. there, we do get the end of Germany's war. People are just tired of fighting by this point. And so, especially the Germans, are going to force the Kaiser to abdicate. And abdicate means that he's going to turn over his throne. He's giving up power in his government. And the Germans instead are going to establish a representative government in order to negotiate peace terms, because the U.S. and the Allies basically said, we're not going to negotiate with another monarchy. We need a representative form of government. And so they create one. The problem is that this is a worldwide war. So when do you stop it? Where do you stop it? How do you stop it? Well, what they come up with is this thing called an armistice. And an armistice is a ceasefire. It is not a peace treaty. It doesn't end the war. Instead, it just says, I agree to stop shooting you if you agree to stop shooting me. So they decide to pass it for the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, which is November 11th at 11 a.m. Everyone would agree to stop fighting. And Germany had to do 3 things just to get to the armistice. So just to get to this peace, or not peace treaty, to this ceasefire, they had to, number 1, cancel their peace treaty with Russia. Remember, Russia dropped out in 1917, signed a separate peace treaty with Germany, and the Allies say, you got to get rid of that. Can't have that. The second is they had to surrender their U-boats because we wanted to look at them to see how to make the things. We were very interested in them. And the third is that they had to release their war prisoners. Now, we didn't have to release our war prisoners, but they had to release theirs. And so this ends up being a huge humiliation for the Germans. It is not a good ending to this war at all. German officials are going to be taken by rail car and forced to sign the armistice. There's no negotiations. And this is something that was not regularly done. When you had an enemy that you had fought against for 4 years on an equal playing field and nobody really knew the answer of who was going to win, you don't treat them like they're children who acted naughty. That wasn't something that was done. And so this is going to lead us, we can already see the beginnings of World War II at the end of World War I, because there's huge portents for the future. You have a young wounded soldier who had breathed in chlorine gas and was recovering. And he is recovering in an Austrian field hospital when he reads how the Germans were being treated. And his name is Adolf Hitler. And he had fought for Germany. He fought with Austria in World War I, and he was injured, and he hears how the Germans were being treated, which was not in a good way at all. And he's going to remember the things that were done, and that's going to come back and bite us in the butt big time.